When the Ruger Mini-14 first showed up in 1974, there really wasn't anything else quite like it available. It filled an important gap in the firearms market and quickly became one of the best-selling centerfire rifles in the country. Now, almost 50 years later, the preferences of the average gun buyer have drastically changed, but the Mini-14 is practically the same as it ever was. The demise of this rifle has been predicted many times in recent years, but against all odds, Ruger is still making them and shooters are still buying them. They're not as popular as they once were, but at least for right now, the Mini-14 is not dead yet. To understand how this is possible, it might help to look at what made the Mini-14 such a big success to begin with. So let's go back in time, back to 1959.
The M14 rifle, 7.62 millimeter, is a lightweight shoulder weapon. It is somewhat similar to the M1 rifle in functioning and appearance, but with additional characteristics of other small arms. The M14 rifle will, in time, replace these four weapons. The adoption of the
M14 turned out to not be the ideal solution the U.S. military had hoped for. It was not a bad rifle, but for its intended role, the 7.62 NATO cartridge was too powerful, the gun was too heavy, and too expensive to produce. After only 5 years, it was replaced with the M16. By about the mid-1970s, there were semi-auto only commercial versions of the M14 available on the civilian market, but they were mostly just used for long-range competition shooting. They used them a lot in high-power matches. They really didn't fit the needs of the average shooter, and it's kind of for the same reasons the gun failed in the military. It was too heavy, it was too expensive, and it was really just too much gun for most purposes. But the M14 still had some appealing features. It had a traditional wood stock with the Garand style action that American shooters were accustomed to, and it had detachable magazines with double-digit capacity, something very uncommon among civilian firearms at the time. The major exception was the World War II surplus M1-carbine, also very well liked, although a little underpowered. If a semi-auto M14 could somehow be made smaller and cheaper and chambered for a round with a bit more practical usefulness than .30 carbine, it could be massively successful. And that's essentially what Bill Ruger had in mind when he got his design team to start working on a scaled-down M14 based on the .223 Remington cartridge. Within 5 years, Ruger was showing off the first pre-production samples of the new Mini-14 rifle. Mass production started soon after, and by 1974, dealers were stocking a gun that turned out to be immediately popular with customers. The original models bore a strong resemblance to the M1 carbine. They were slightly heavier, but still very light at just 6.4 pounds. They had an 18.5-inch barrel, aperture-style iron sights, and they fed from 5 or 20-round detachable magazines. The rotating bolt design looked like it came straight from an M1 Garand or M1 carbine. Ruger also borrowed the trigger guard style manual safety from the Garand. All of this would have looked and felt very familiar to shooters in the 1970s. The only thing that was really new and different was the .223 Remington cartridge, which was not yet widely used outside of the military. I have here a copy of the Gun Digest Annual from 1973. Every year they print a catalog of all of the firearms in current production. In this edition, the auto-loading centerfire rifle section is just these 2 pages, 11 entries total. 3 of them are commercial copies of the M1 carbine, which means there's a good chance they probably didn't work very well. There's a weird little 9mm carbine up here. Of course, we got the Colt AR-15 Sporter. The rest of these are very traditional hunting rifles. And this is what I mean by there being a huge gap in the market. Practically speaking, the AR-15 was similar to the Mini-14. Both rifles could do essentially the same thing, but the Colt was expensive, about $1,600 when you adjust for inflation. It had plastic furniture and a bizarre appearance. It also had a really poor reputation. Bureaucratic incompetence had caused a bunch of problems with the early M16s in Vietnam. It was decades before the commercial version of that rifle was widely accepted by civilian shooters. Now, I'm no historian or sociologist, but I think this period was probably a turning point for a lot of American gun owners, just like it was for American culture in general. Think about what else was going on around this time. We were still in Vietnam, which nobody was really happy about. Nixon resigned in '74. Americans' trust in the government was at an all-time low. And of course, we still had the constant threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union and a lot of social unrest. I think it would be completely understandable if a lot of Americans, maybe for the first time, started thinking they might need to take more control of their own security. Even though Ruger marketed the Mini-14 as a law enforcement rifle, on the civilian side, all the advertising was exclusively about hunting. But it didn't take long for shooters to notice that it could also be ideal for protecting their home and family if society really started falling apart. And its traditional appearance meant that you could buy one without people thinking you were trying to be some kind of survivalist commando. In a 1974 review, Colonel Jeff Cooper wrote, "It'll do everything the M16 will do, but better. It is light, handy, quick, and gentle, and it shoots practically forever without reloading. And at defensive ranges across the yard, it strikes a wicked blow. A Mini-14 over the kitchen door would be well worth its price in peace of mind." The price tag on the Mini-14 started out at $200, and that's where it stayed for the first several years. That's the equivalent of about $1,300 today, so it was by no means a cheap rifle. But then throughout all the crazy high inflation of the late 1970s, Ruger raised the price very little. So by 1980, it was the equivalent of $830, which was a little more than half what it cost for a Colt AR at the time. The Mini-14's success continued into the 1980s, including several new variants. They made a stainless steel model and a version chambered for 7.62x3.9 called the Mini-30. Both of those are still around today. The ranch rifle was basically a Mini-14 that's machined for scope rings. That eventually became a standard feature on all Minis. At some point, Ruger added 10 and 30 round magazines to the original 5 and 20 rounders. The 20 and 30 round factory mags were tough to find outside of law enforcement dealers. It sounds like they were available on the commercial market, they just were not always common. Ruger did make some variants of the rifle itself that were totally restricted to law enforcement and military sales. The Mini-14 GB had a flash hider, a bayonet lug, and an optional folding stock with a pistol grip. The AC-556 was a select fire version with full auto and 3-round burst modes. But many of the rifles that were picked up by police and foreign militaries were no different than the commercial Mini-14, partly because those guns had a lower social profile. They were supposedly less likely to freak out the average citizen compared to a more modern style rifle. And now we have to talk about 1989. I hate to get into anything political, but this is an important part of the Mini-14's history, so here we go. In the late 80s, politicians from both major parties were making a lot of noise about major gun control legislation. George Bush Sr. even talked about a complete ban on semi-automatics. The gun industry was already going through a major financial slump. A semi-auto ban would only make matters worse. So Bill Ruger thought he could divert attention away from an outright ban if he threw the politicians a different bone to chew on. In 1989, he wrote Congress a letter that basically said, instead of going to all the trouble of trying to codify what is and is not an assault rifle, why don't you just ban magazines that hold more than 15 rounds? Around the same time, Ruger completely restricted sales of 20 and 30 round Mini-14 mags to law enforcement only. Maybe Ruger was just trying to save his business, but needless to say, a lot of gun owners felt like this was a blatant betrayal. There were boycotts and a lot of angry letters, but the Mini-14 continued to be a big seller. 5 years later, Bill Clinton signed the assault weapons ban into law. It came with a 10-year expiration date, and it banned the sale of new rifles with certain cosmetic features like flash hiders and folding stocks.
without eroding the rights of sportsmen and women in this country, we will finally ban these assault weapons from our street that have no purpose other than to kill.
It also came with a magazine ban, but instead of the 15 rounds that Ruger suggested, you could not buy new mags with a capacity greater than 10. Well, the Mini-14 didn't have any of the forbidden features listed in the ban. In fact, it was on a list of guns that were specifically exempt from the ban. A lot of other companies had to stop production and design specially modified versions of their rifles that would comply with the new rules. Meanwhile, the Mini-14 on the shelf at the gun shop was just the same as it had always been. Despite whether it was a good seller, the gun was not without its problems, and by this time they were fairly well known among shooters. Because the Ruger factory 20 and 30 round mags were so hard to get, a lot of third-party companies stepped in to fill in the gap. But some of those mags didn't work all that well, and that ended up giving the rifle itself a reputation for being unreliable. Ruger was pretty stingy about sending out spare parts, so if anything went wrong with your gun, you pretty much had to send it back to the factory. The action was really hard on scopes and scope mounts, and the safety is not really in the most safe position. You have to stick your finger inside the trigger guard to use it. But the biggest complaint by far was accuracy. Back when the gun came out in the 70s, 3 to 5 MOA was considered completely acceptable for a practical field rifle like the Mini-14. But by the late 1990s, shooters were expecting tighter groups, even from their semi-autos. In the 2000s, a bunch of events took place in quick succession that all had an impact on the Mini-14. First, in 2000, Bill Ruger Sr. retired and handed over his company to his son. He passed away 2 years later. In 2004, Congress did not renew the assault weapons ban, so it expired. However, Ruger still restricted sales of the higher capacity Mini-14 mags to law enforcement only. In 2005, Ruger made some major improvements to the Mini-14 design, resulting in slightly more accurate rifles. The post-05 models have a serial number beginning with 5.8 and a distinctive tapered barrel. In 2006, Bill Ruger Jr. retired. From then on, no one from the Ruger family held any kind of official influence on the company. The new leadership at Ruger made a commitment to serve more defense-minded customers. That included, in 2008, the return of 20-round Mini-14 mags for everyone. All right, here we go. First shots with a Mini-14 in 15 years. Ruger as a whole has thrived under the new leadership, but it's hard to say the same thing for the Mini-14 in particular. The gun industry changed dramatically between the mid-90s and the late 2000s. AR-15s were not just Colts anymore, and they were no longer considered unreliable or obscure. High demand for black rifles drove competition. That competition drove down prices, and the next thing you know, the Mini-14 no longer stood out as an affordable alternative to the AR. Not bad. Even just 10 years ago, I remember often hearing people say, a Mini-14 is okay if you can't afford a decent AR. But now, nobody's even really saying that. Let's take a look at the historical price difference between a basic Mini-14 and a basic Colt AR. Prices of both have risen with inflation over the years, but that price gap has narrowed to nothing. And today, the MSRP of a new Mini-14 is actually a couple $100 more than a basic Colt M4. Now let's throw some budget ARs in there. Those started popping up around the mid-90s, and at first, they were not that good, but that has changed over time. By 2015, you could get a Smith & Wesson M&P 15 Sport, a very solid AR, for $170 less than a Mini-14. And now today, you can get 2 Palmetto State ARs for less than 1 Mini. And it's not just an issue of the cost of the gun. Basic 30-round AR mags are less than half the cost of 20 and 30-round Ruger mags. And of course, ARs have normalized the flat top upper and Picatinny rails everywhere. An entire industry has emerged around personalizing and customizing your modern AR or other rifle. The Mini-14 did not get invited to that party. So for a lot of today's shooters, this gun looks not just dated, but pretty much obsolete. So why is the Mini-14 still around? Somebody's buying them, even at today's prices. What can a Mini do that a scary black rifle cannot do? That is what we're going to be looking at in part 2. Hope you guys enjoyed part 1. Until next time, be sure to get all your ammo from us with lightning fast shipping at luckygunner.com.